The Adulting with ADHD podcast is not a substitute for medical advice. Please see a medical professional if you think you have ADHD or if you have questions about your current treatment. To support this podcast or to access the podcast archives, visit patreon.com/adultingwithadhd. This is the Adulting with ADHD podcast, self-empowerment for people with ADHD.
Hello, Adulting with ADHD fam. In between interviews this past year, I've also been working on a separate project, and I wanted to share the first piece of it. We'll be back to talk about hormones, and after a couple of episodes of that, we'll be transitioning to discussing ADHD and trauma. This is a story about hormones. Mostly the female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, although there's definitely way more to it. I should probably back up a bit. Rewind to 2020 at the height of the first wave of the coronavirus pandemic. A curious revelation about the relationship between estrogen, ADHD, and medication. Heavy rethinking the entire course of my podcast. It would ultimately change how I saw my mental health treatment in general.
And estrogen proves to be very similar to dopamine. And dopamine is the neurotransmitter in the brain that's involved in ADHD. It helps us to focus, to have overview, to have peace of mind, to feel happiness and reward, and to be focused, and to be able to control anger and other emotions. So if you have enough dopamine, you're more stable.
This was one of my guests, Dr. Sandra Cooey, who has studied women with ADHD as a psychiatrist for more than 20 years. As head of the adult ADHD program of PsyQ in the Netherlands.
And that's exactly what ADHD people often are not. They're not stable. They're moody. They're hyperactive, impulsive, inattentive, chaotic, and their mood changes all the time, every day. But when estrogen goes down in women with ADHD, in that premenstrual week, for instance, you have twice nothing.
Twice nothing. During this time, I had started to wonder if my estrogen tank was working with twice nothing. I was now in my 40s and started to notice my cognition suffering and my periods getting chaotic as hell. Naturally, I went to my OBGYN to try to glean some understanding. In addition to dismissing my mention of having ADHD, he just seemed generally bored with the whole conversation and ordered tests. Long story short, nothing gyno was wrong with me. There it was, nothing gyno. Could be mental, except that if I tell my mental health provider about my menstrual problems, they're going to send me to the OBG, which is exactly what happened. The OBG did throw some birth controls my way before sending me off, and this was to help balance the possible progesterone surplus that was in my body from my next full-on birth control implant. What I quickly have learned from this experience is that there's so much we don't know, and so much we don't know to know, because the research of women's bodies is inadequate at best. And what's there doesn't necessarily trickle down to our doctors. We'll dive into some of these experiences a little deeper, but today we're just going to do something really brief and high level. So let's get into it. Do you know what neurohormones are? I didn't know this until recently. To extremely oversimplify, they are hormones that double as neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters, which are the chemical messengers that send information within our brain and from our brain to our nervous system. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter. Serotonin, as in the drug class selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, aka SSRIs. How about progesterone? That's in every hormonal contraceptive, but it's also been linked to depression when it's out of balance. We've all heard the tired tropes of hormonal women at key moments of their lives. But did you know estrogen can mask schizophrenia in some women, leading them to have their first psychotic episode when going through perimenopause? Then there's the thyroid, which, when out of balance, can look a lot like depression. And then there's testosterone, commonly associated with sex drive and streak. It impacts mood and motivation too. And then finally, there's DHEA, cortisol, and insulin, all which, surprise, can also mess up your mental health. Do you feel like we talk about any of these enough? I don't, and I'd like to think I've been paying pretty close attention as someone who's been in the healthcare system since college. That's more than 2 decades, and it wasn't as a passive participant. So back to 2020, my ADHD and my maybe perimenopause. In this interview with Dr. Cooey, I learned that estrogen reinforces dopamine. And if you're ADHD, you already have problems with dopamine. And then when you're PMSing, you're low on both dopamine from your period and from just having ADHD. When you're perimenopausal, your estrogen starts peaking. Hormone levels aside, even just the fluctuation of hormones can do damage. Just think about breastfeeding mom. Talk about a hormone dip. They even have estrogen therapy to address depression of perimenopausal women. So here's my question. How could something as huge as hormones be so elusive to us when it has such a huge impact on our lives? ADHD, depression, anxiety, and more. They're making and breaking careers, marriages, bodies, and families. Imagine taking something like Adderall in hopes of improving your job performance to save your job, only to hit perimenopause and, unbeknownst to you, the medicine may as well be a placebo. To add insult to injury, we've been gaslit by doctors, to the point that we're questioning if this is even happening. I'm pretty sure it is, and it hasn't been made a priority by any of the institutions where our doctors have studied and trained. Based on my experience, the doctor writes another script from their grab bag of wall spaghetti, and then we're on our way none the wiser. And if you're left to trust they're well versed in the fire points of estrogen mental health, spoiler alert, this isn't necessarily the case. In this series, we're going to speak about systemic failures of not just women, but Black, Indigenous, people of color, and trans communities. We're going to talk about underutilized resources such as doulas and how our brains change at all the critical hormonal fluctuation points of our lives, including puberty, pregnancy, and menopause. We're also going to talk about trauma, eating disorders, substance abuse, and how hormones work into all of this. And one final and important note, this is a touching standpoint for some. I understand. We obviously don't want to be reduced down to our hormones. However, in my experience, getting hormones into the conversation doesn't work against the patient. It doesn't pathologize her as a hormone mess, in my view. Rather, it makes it possible for her to even have a fighting chance of navigating her mental health and her reproductive health too.
I don't know if you've ever been put on a waiting list, but therapy is hard to come by these days. If you need therapy and you need someone to talk to, consider BetterHelp. I've been using BetterHelp on and off since the pandemic, and it's honestly been really helpful when I can't reach my normal therapist. To save 10% off your first month, visit betterhelp.com/ADHD adulting. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/ADHD adulting.